invited to address this topic of who writes our past. And I must say, to be here at the annual National History Conference is also a matter of great satisfaction for me. You gather at a moment when questions of history are no longer confined to academia. I know many of you are research scholars and academics, but let's face it, they have become part of public discourse in ways that are both visible and consequential. Debates about the past are unfolding, not only in seminars, conferences, history classes, but also in scholarly journals, and then beyond that, in legislatures, in courtrooms, on television screens, and of course across the many social media platforms through which opinion is shaped and conducted. So the question, who writes our past, is actually much more relevant, or as relevant outside the classroom as in the classroom. So when we ask this question, we are really asking something fundamental. We are asking who has the authority to interpret the past, whose voices are heard in that interpretation, and how those interpretations shape the way in which our nation understands itself. It is often assumed that history is a settled body of knowledge waiting to be consulted, and that's perhaps a very naive idea, but we all know the reality is very different. History is not simply a record of what happened, it is a field of ongoing research and interpretation. Each generation revisits it, re-examines it, and in some measure reshapes it. Textbooks are revised, historical figures are reinterpreted, events are viewed through new lenses, and inherited narratives are either affirmed or challenged. What changes is not the past itself, but the meaning that we attach to the past. So the past in that sense is never entirely past. And it is precisely this relationship between history, interpretation, and power that I would like to reflect on this morning. To understand the contest over our past, it is necessary to draw a distinction that is often overlooked in public debate: the distinction between history and historiography. History in the simplest sense is what happened, the events that unfolded, the processes that shaped societies, the lives that were lived, all of that. Historiography, however, is more layered. It is the manner in which those events are recorded, interpreted, presented. If history is the past itself, historiography is the story that we construct about that past. And that story is never entirely neutral, for the writing of history is shaped not only by evidence but by perspective, by the questions we ask, the sources we privilege, and the silences we sometimes inherit. Above all, it is shaped by power. The struggle over history is in many ways a struggle over identity and belonging, over how a people understands itself, how it situates itself in time, and how it chooses to define its place in the world. We see this clearly, perhaps more clearly than in the issues you're discussing today, in the case of colonial historiography. British accounts of India did not simply document the subcontinent, they interpreted very much in the interests of and through the lens of empire. They emphasized our divisions over any continuity in our culture, our stagnation over any evidence of dynamism, and in doing so they constructed a narrative that made the imperial role appear both necessary and justified. India was presented as a civilization in need of governance. In fact, some did not even present us as a civilization, but a barbarism in need of civilizing, rather than one with its own long and evolving tradition of political, social, and intellectual life. Now, such imperial narratives were not incidental to the colonial project, they served a purpose. They legitimized British conquest, they rationalized our subordination, and they taught the colonized to see themselves through categories devised by their rulers. That, after all, is one of the enduring lessons of colonialism. Political domination is reinforced by narrative domination. Now, when you are looking at all of this, how do we find the reaction with independence? And even with the nationalist movement, there rose voices who were anxious to recover a sense of civilizational confidence. History then became, in that moment, not merely a record of what had been, but a resource for imagining what could be. So figures such as Dadabhai Naoroji, R.C. Dutt, many other writers of the late 19th century, thinkers like Gokhale, Tilak, on opposite ends of the political spectrum of the Indian National Congress, later Gandhi, Nehru, Jinnah, countless others. They were not only resisting imperial rule in the political sphere, they were resisting imperial interpretations in their intellectual sphere. They understood that to recover a people's sense of agency, one had also to recover a sense of historical selfhood. And yet the process did not end there. In our own time, history continues to be revisited, misinterpreted, and at times contested with renewed intensity. The past is invoked in political debate, in cultural discourse, in public life, often to serve present-day political purposes. Narratives are emphasized or simplified, sometimes selectively, in ways that reflect contemporary concerns as much as historical realities. What this tells us is something fundamental. History is not a fixed inheritance, but an ongoing conversation. And the manner in which that conversation is conducted has profound implications, not only for how we understand the past, but for how we define ourselves in the present. It is this interpretation, this interplay between interpretation and identity that brings us to the idea of national history. If historiography tells us that the past is interpreted rather than simply recorded, the idea of national history reveals why those interpretations matter so deeply. Every nation, in one way or the other, constructs a narrative about its past. It does not do so merely to remember, but to create a sense of continuity, to connect generations, to define identity, and to give meaning to the present. A national history, therefore, is never just a chronicle of events. It's a story a society likes to tell itself about who it is, who we are. But such a story can be told in different ways. It can be expansive, accommodating complexity, acknowledging the many strands that have contributed to a nation's evolution. Or it can be selective, narrowing the past into a more simplified account that privileges certain experiences while overlooking others. The difference between the two is not merely academic. It shapes how citizens understand their place within the nation. It influences whether the nation is imagined as a shared inheritance or as the property of a favored few. Now, this is particularly significant in our country because India's past does not lend itself easily to a single linear narrative. It is not the story of just one people, one language, or one faith unfolding in isolation. It is instead the story of a civilization that has evolved through interaction, through encounters, through exchanges, through adaptations over some centuries. Some of you may be not familiar with Jawaharlal Nehru's metaphor of the palimpsest. A palimpsest would be something like, for example, if I write on that wall, and Mujib there comes and writes on top of what I have written, and then Adib Saab comes and writes on top of what I have written, and this lady here comes and writes on top of what Adib Saab has written, and so on and so forth. But nothing erases what has been written before. Everything is there. That, in many ways, is the story of Indian history. Now, this understanding is at the heart of what Tagore described as the idea of India. The notion that India is defined not by uniformity, but by the coexistence of differences. It is the idea that recognizes plurality, not as a challenge for India's identity or to be managed, but as a condition to be embraced, as a reality of our existence. In that sense, the idea of India was never a sentimental slogan. It was and remains a profoundly serious proposition. But how a civilization of immense diversity may yet sustain a common civic life. That is why reducing India to a singular cultural or religious narrative is not merely historically unsound. It is a misunderstanding of the very basis on which India has imagined itself in modern times. Seen in this light, historiography becomes much more than a matter of academic debate. It becomes central to how we imagine our nation itself. For the way we narrate our past influences the boundaries we draw in the present, the lines between inclusion and exclusion, between belonging and otherness. If the past is presented as singular and homogeneous, the nation too begins to be imagined in those terms. If, however, the past is understood as layered and diverse, the nation can be seen as capacious, able to accommodate multiple identities without anxiety. And that's why the writing of national history carries such weight. It is not only about what is remembered, but about how that memory is organized and to what end, what purpose. It can either deepen our understanding of a shared inheritance, or it can reduce it to a narrower narrative shaped by present-day politics and present-day concerns. So the question is not whether we try and tell a national story or many national stories. All nations do. The question is what kind of story we choose to tell. And it is in answering that question that the deeper implications of historiography come into view. Because if we accept that the idea of India rests on plurality, then it follows that its history must be understood in those terms as well. Not as a single uninterrupted narrative, but as a continuum shaped by multiple currents over time. India has never been historically monolithic. Its evolution has been marked not by isolation, but by interaction. Across centuries, different traditions, belief systems, cultural practices have coexisted, overlapped, in many cases influenced one another in ways that are difficult to disentangle. The earlier strands of our civilization were shaped by Vedic thought and practice. These were later enriched and challenged by the emergence of Buddhist and Jain philosophies, which introduced new ethical frameworks and shades of inquiry, as well as modes of inquiry. The centuries that followed saw the rise of the Bhakti movement, which emphasized personal devotion cut across rigid and social hierarchies. And then, of course, alongside all of this came other currents. Islam is a very interesting story. There is a perception in the north that Islam came with the sword, with Muhammad bin Qasim in 712. We in the south have a very different recollection. I will speak as a Keralite. My state, we were used to what the people we today call the Arabs, traveling to Kerala every year for 1,000 years before Islam. They were traveling when the winds were favorable across the Arabian Sea. They would come, they would settle on the west coast of Kerala, they would trade, they would marry locally, they would spend a few months, and when the winds changed, they would go back every year, year after year, for centuries. Centuries. So Islam came to us as news, not through a sword, but as news from people who had been traveling, who were familiar to us, who were part of us in many ways for millennia. And they came to us, people we're familiar with, were trading with us, living with us, and they said, hey, you know what's happening in our peninsula? We have a prophet, and this is what he's saying. So much so that a local Hindu king, Cheruman Perumal, was so excited to hear about this prophet that he organized a flotilla of 22 or 23 ships to go to the Arabian Peninsula so he could meet the prophet. Most of those ships didn't make it. They got stranded in what we today know as Lakshadweep or the Maldives. But he made it. And what is fascinating is that you can see the evidence of his journey even today. In Oman, south of Salalah, there are Kerala coconut trees growing from coconuts he took with him, which are not native to the Arabian Peninsula. Now, this is how we relate to history. And when this Muslim community in Kozhikode and Kochi and that area, the west coast basically, became numerous enough, large enough, that they needed a place to worship, they went to the Zamorin, the local king, and he said, no problem, there is a disused temple you can have it. And so the oldest mosque outside the Arab world in Kodungalur in Kerala is still dominated by an ancient Hindu lamp outside the mosque. The mosque has gone through 5 or 6 major renovations over the centuries. But can you imagine? There is a mosque in India going back within a few decades of the lifetime of the Prophet. Now these are stories that perhaps in the north people are not told or do not know or choose not to remember. But this is why when I talk about multiple histories, even the story of Islam in India has multiple histories and multiple ways of being told and multiple imaginings. This is something we need to understand. And of course, India has never been historically monolithic. Its evolution has, as I said, been marked by lots of interactions. And when you look at all of this, there is simply no doubt that the arrival and spread of Islamic traditions brought with them new forms of philosophy, of ideas, of political organization, of artistic expression, and of intellectual exchange. Over time, these influences did not remain separate. They interacted with the existing traditions in India to produce forms that were distinctly Indian. And none of these were monolithic. There was diversity and pluralism within Vedic thought, within Buddhist thought, within Jain thought, within Puranic thought, debates between the 6 Hindu schools of philosophy, and similarly, there were distinctions amongst various Islamic scholars and preachers as well. We see this clearly, of course, in the cultural sphere. The poetry of Kabir, for instance, drew from both Bhakti and Sufi traditions, resisting easy categorization. The spiritual legacy of figures such as Nizamuddin Aulia reflected a similar blending of influences rooted in the local, even as they drew from wider traditions. Language too evolved in this context, and frankly Hindustani, which emerged as a product of interaction, was shaped by both Sanskritic and Persian influences, with dashes of Arabic and Turkic as well in the army camps of northern India. Even in music, from Qawwali traditions to the evolution of Hindustani classical music, what endured was not separation but synthesis. Architecture offers you another example of this synthesis. What we now describe as Indo-Islamic architecture did not replace what came before, it built upon it, incorporating local materials, techniques, aesthetics, masons, sculptors, who are already in India, into new forms. The result was not a rupture but a layering of Indian architecture. One might think of the Qutub complex, of Fatehpur Sikri, of Humayun's tomb, of the Taj Mahal, not merely as monuments of various dynasties, but as evidence of a civilization in conversation with itself. Now, this pattern of interaction continued into the colonial period when new ideas of law, governance, and modern political organization entered the subcontinent. These two were not simply imposed or passively received, they were adapted, contested, reinterpreted within an existing civilizational framework. What emerges from this long history is not a story of separate strands moving in parallel, but of continuous engagement. Traditions did not merely coexist, they shaped one another. Influences were not simply added, they were absorbed, transformed, and made part of a larger whole. This is why any attempt to reduce India's past to a single narrative, whether cultural, religious, or political, inevitably falls short. It overlooks the very processes through which the civilization evolved. India did not grow by excluding influences, but by absorbing them. To recognize this is not to deny conflict nor to romanticize the past. It is simply to acknowledge that complexity is intrinsic to India's historical experience. And it is precisely this complexity that is often simplified when history is interpreted selectively in the present. If India's history has been shaped through multiple overlapping influences, then any serious account of that past must acknowledge the range of forces that contributed to it. Among these, the role of Islamic traditions and Muslim communities, which is of course the major theme of your conference, is neither incidental nor peripheral. Over several centuries, they were active participants in shaping India's political structures, cultural life, urban development. Systems of governance that were refined in cities such as Delhi, Agra, Lahore emerged as centers of power and exchange, and traditions of music, architecture, and literature flourished in forms that remain integral to India's cultural landscape. The evolution of languages such as Hindustani and Urdu is itself a testament to sustained interaction across communities. Now, these developments were not external impositions operating in isolation. They unfolded within our country, within our subcontinent, and became part of its lived experience. What emerged was not a series of parallel histories, but an altered, shared, entangled one. This is an important distinction because there is a world of difference between acknowledging conquest and mistaking an entire era for conquest alone, between recognizing episodes of violence and reducing centuries of social, artistic, linguistic, and administrative interaction and change to violence alone. At the same time, it is important to approach the past with clarity. There were periods of conflict, as there have been in every phase of history, but to view an entire period through a lens of that conflict is to miss the much larger processes that shape society over centuries. And let's face it, we all know that Islam was no monolith and nor were Islamic ideas only of one kind. There were various interactions right up to the moment of partition. Would you say that Jinnah's ideas about Islam and Islam's role in Indian history were the same as Maulana Azad's, or of the sadly forgotten Allah Bakhsh, the Chief Minister of Sindh, who when he spoke in Delhi in 1943 had a 3 times larger audience than Jinnah did? People forget that there are other views, even within each community. And I say this particularly because selective interpretation has now become a significant issue in our historiography. In recent years, this part of India's past has often been framed in narrower terms. Episodes of conquest or destruction in the so-called Muslim period are highlighted, while the longer history of interaction, adaptation, coexistence receives far less attention. The complexity of a civilizational process is reduced to a sequence of isolated events. What was once understood as layered history risks being recast as a very simplified narrative. They came, they oppressed us, we have found our glory. Not good enough. This is not merely a question of emphasis. It alters the way the past is understood. When history is presented selectively, it becomes easier to draw sharper lines in the present. Communities that once interacted are reimagined as standing apart. A shared past is reframed as a contested one. The consequence is not greater historical clarity, but a narrowing of perspective. One ends up with a past stripped of nuance and a present stripped of generosity. To recognize the full range of influences that have shaped India is not to romanticize history, nor to deny its tensions. It is to resist the temptation to flatten our history. A serious engagement with the past requires us to hold together its contradictions and to see it as a continuous process of interactions, not a series of disconnected episodes. And it's precisely when this continuity is overlooked that history becomes more vulnerable to interpretation or reinterpretation for the political purposes of the present. If history is shaped by interpretation and interpretation is shaped by power, then it is in the present that the relationship becomes most visible. Because we're living at a time when history has moved decisively out of the archive and into the public sphere, as I said at the very beginning of my talk. It is no longer mediated primarily by historians, but by a wider set of actors, political institutions, courts, media platforms, and increasingly so-called public opinion itself. In this environment, the past is not only studied, it is actively deployed. History, in other words, has become a site of contestation. Mujibur Rahman knows that. He's written a book talking about some of this. What is at stake in these contestations is not merely the accuracy of historical detail, but the authority to define meaning. Competing narratives of the past are advanced not simply to interpret events, but to establish legitimacy in the present. The question is no longer only what happened, but what that past is taken to signify today. This shift from description to meaning is not in itself unusual. Societies have always interpreted their past in light of present concerns. What is distinctive today, however, is the speed and scale at which such interpretations are circulating and the degree to which they are amplified without the tempering influence of historical method. Assertions travel faster than arguments. Simplifications gain traction more easily than nuance. In such an environment, the authority of the historian is often challenged, not by better evidence, but by louder conviction. The result is a curious inversion. Instead of the past informing the present increasingly seeks to influence the past, to instruct the past, to reshape it in accordance with contemporary anxieties, contemporary aspirations. And in doing so, it risks substituting historical understanding with historical assertion. This is why debates over history today carry a different intensity. They're often framed in terms of restitution, recognition, redress. There is an understandable desire to revisit the past, to re-examine inherited narratives, and to question earlier interpretations. No problem with that. Such re-examination is in itself a necessary part of any serious engagement with history. But there is also a risk. When the past is approached primarily through the lens of the present and present-day grievances, it can be reconfigured into a more linear and simplified narrative than it ever was. Complex historical processes are reduced to moral binaries, political binaries very often. Long periods of interaction are compressed into isolated moments of conflict. Historical actors are judged less in the context of their own time than through the expectations of our time. The desire for moral clarity in the present can produce historical distortion in retrospect. In such a framework, history begins to shift from inquiry to assertion. This is particularly visible in the treatment of symbols and sites that carry historical significance. Monuments, places of worship, and public memory become focal points for contemporary debates. What they represent is not only a record of the past, but a claim about the present. The effort to reinterpret or reclaim them often rests on the assumption that history can be retrospectively settled. Yet history does not lend itself easily to such a closure. It is not a ledger that can be balanced. It's not a verdict that can be revised by a review bench without consequences. Attempts to correct the past, when pursued without regard for historical complexity, can generate new tensions even as they seek to address old ones. In the process, we may end up turning history from a source of understanding into a mere vocabulary of grievance. At a deeper level, what we are witnessing is a shift in the function of history itself. Instead of serving as a means of understanding the evolution of our society, our history is increasingly drawn into the project of defining identity. It is used to delineate boundaries, to separate communities, to separate narratives, and to separate competing visions of the nation. In doing so, it risks narrowing a past that was in reality far more expansive and far more inclusive. The consequence is not merely a difference of interpretation, but a transformation in how the past is engaged with. History ceases to be a field of inquiry and becomes a resource to be mobilized. And when that happens, the danger is not only that we misunderstand the past, but that we constrain and limit the possibilities of our present. What then does responsible historiography require? It requires first and foremost intellectual seriousness. It requires fidelity to evidence, a respect for context, and a refusal to force the past into the service of the predetermined conclusions and agenda of the present. It requires us to distinguish between inquiry and advocacy, between interpretation and instrumentalization. It also requires humility, because the past is always larger than the narratives we construct about it. In the Indian context, responsible historiography must be equal to the scale and diversity of the civilization it's seeking to describe. It must be able to hold together multiple strands without panic, to recognize continuity without erasing conflict, and to recognize conflict without denying continuity. It must resist both sentimental nostalgia and partisan simplification. This surely is what the better traditions of Indian thought have asked of us. Nehruji saw India as layered and cumulative, a civilization, as I said earlier, a palimpsest marked by successive accretions rather than a singular essence. Gandhiji's moral imagination, in a different register, insisted upon coexistence as an ethical principle. They did not imagine India as a brittle identity sustained by exclusion, but as a shared inheritance made possible by accommodation. A confident nation does not fear complexity in its past. It has the courage to look at history in its fullness, neither sanitized nor weaponized. It does not seek from history the comfort of unanimity, but the discipline of understanding. We return then, and I need to wrap up now, to the question with which we began. Who writes our past? The answer, as we have seen, is not confined to historians alone. It lies with institutions, with politicians, educators, with those who shape public discourse, and in the broader sense, it lies with all of us. For a way in which a society remembers the past is never entirely separate from the way it understands itself in the present. History is not simply inherited. It is interpreted, it is debated, and at times it is contested. But the manner in which we engage with it carries consequences. A past that is narrowed becomes a present that is divided. A past that is approached with openness allows for a more expansive understanding of our present-day belonging. In a civilization as layered as India's, this choice requires particular significance and acquires particular significance. The story of India cannot be reduced to a single thread without losing what makes it distinctive. It is and has always been a confluence of influences, a record of encounters that have shaped a shared, if complex, inheritance that is for all of us. To recognize this is not to deny difference, but to situate it within a larger continuity. The task before us, therefore, is not to arrive at a single definitive account of the past, but to preserve the conditions under which multiple accounts can coexist. Your history, my history, her history, how does it matter? Let all of them exist, let all of them be examined and where necessary be challenged, but when history is approached with seriousness, it does not offer certitudes in any case. It offers understanding. It does not close the right to question, it refines the questions. And in this sense, the writing of history is not only an intellectual exercise, it's a civic exercise. It shapes the terms on which we relate to one another, the boundaries that we draw, and the possibilities we imagine for ourselves as a society. And perhaps this is where the deeper responsibility lies. Not merely in getting the past right, because there may be no one right. There may be very many complicated interpretations. I think of one example, I don't know if anybody is presenting a discussion on that, the so-called Mopla rebellion in Kerala in the 1920s, when there are so many dramatically contested narratives. There is a liberal Muslim interpretation of a secular Muslim anti-colonial revolt. There is a Marxist or class-based interpretation of a peasant revolt against landlords. The landlords happened to be Hindu, the peasants happened to be Muslim, therefore it was not communal according to the Marxists. Now there is a new so-called Hindu nationalist interpretation which sees this purely in communal terms. There are more complex interpretations that sees elements of all of these in what happened. And there are pieces of evidence to support every interpretation. How do you tell the story? How do you work it out? But that is precisely the point. It is part of the possibilities we imagine for ourselves as a society that we see all these sides at the same time. So, as I say, it's not merely about getting the past right. It's in ensuring that our engagement with it enlarges rather than diminishes the horizons of the present. For a nation's relationship with its history is ultimately a reflection of its confidence in itself. A society that is secure in itself, secure in our identity, we can afford complexity. One that is not secure will seek refuge in simplification. The question, therefore, is not only who writes our past, but whether we have the intellectual honesty and the civic courage to allow that past to remain as rich, as layered, and as open as it truly is. A nation that is at ease with the complexity of its history is better placed not only to sustain the diversity of its present, but to imagine a future that is worthy of that inheritance. I really thank you all for listening to me.